Well, we're back for another journey through media ecology with two of what I consider leading lights. I've met Clinton recently, and I really enjoy his explanation of McLuhan media studies. But Scott, I've gone back with him for years. He went on my radio show back when it was just started off in WFLA Orlando, and you should have seen the face of the board op as Scott was diving into Finnegan's Wake right after Rush Limbaugh's show had aired after my program. I mean, that was such a culture clash, but Scott just kept going. And I'm glad to have Scott Talkington and Clinton Ignatov back on the program. Thanks for you guys joining me.
I'm glad to be here, man.
Thank you. Glad to be here myself.
Now, this is a hybrid. This is both a Zoom video call, but this is also airing on radio. And so, as such, we are in a Zoom chat right now where I can see you guys, but since you're not radio people, I'm a radio person. You can't see me. I'm just a voice, and that is a little bit unfair. But at the same time, it also kind of helps the blending of both the video format of this program and the radio format.
It certainly helps me feel like I'm more on radio. So yeah,
right.
It works.
So, Scott, for folks who don't know what your background is, are you currently working with any group? I know you've worked with different groups on media studies. What do you currently got going on, Scott?
Well, not very much. I'm just I'm just continuing to, expand my horizons, I guess you would say, and understand what's going on. I'm still doing some work with Dave Armour on education analysis, basically K-12 analysis in various states, and with respect to the funding and racial disparities and things like that. That's always been sort of my day job. And I'm also formally an Americanist, in that I was basically kind of an understudy for Seymour Martin Lipset, who wrote a number of books on American exceptionalism and stuff. So you could say I'm an American exceptionalist. And I more recently got interested in René Girard's theories about mimetic rivalry and stuff like that, and then modified those ideas with some insights from Marshall McLuhan and the McLuhanites, and I'm now kind of integrating that with what I'm understanding about electric universe theory and the notion of self-organizing plasmas.
And you also were a proponent of John Deely's semiotic work, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, did you read that?
No, I opened it. It was too big, and I just put it back on the shelf. But I'm going to get to it one day.
He wrote that whole thing in 48 hours.
Oh my goodness, the whole thing, ages.
That entire book, The 4 Ages of Understanding, he wrote in 48 hours, living in Mexico.
You know, it's so funny, Clinton, because we just made a joke about that. You and I don't know if that was on air or off air recently when we did that, where I said The 4 Ages, and I was like, did you read that today or something? And we're like, yeah. And you're like, yeah, I did. I read it in a day or something. Remember that? That's so funny that he said he wrote it in 48. Wow. That's
yeah, that's incredible. No, I flipped through the first part of Deely's I think it's called The Objective World or something. It was his later book about
purely objective reality.
Purely objective reality, yeah. So it helped freshen in my mind a lot of the things Scott's told me about before. It's very intriguing because it made sense right off the bat. So that's always a good sign.
I'm referring to 4 Ages of Understanding. Is that the one you said he wrote in 48 hours, Scott?
Yeah.
Lord, that's the size of the Bible. I'm looking at it right now on the shelf.
Yeah, it's huge. It's almost 1,000 pages.
So was he like channeling or something too, or what's going on here?
He just, I guess this was stuff that understanding that he just built up. He probably had some notes to go on that organized it, and he just launched into it while he was on vacation in Mexico, and that's what came out. And then he refined it later on. I mean, probably added footnotes and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, and purely objective reality is sort of his short book on the same topic.
Mhm.
So he gets right to the heart of the matter really quickly in that book, as
Mhm.
opposed to going through the whole evolution of philosophy from the original philosophers who basically took the ideas. They took second nature, and the project was to use second nature in order to understand first nature, and that was the whole project in philosophy and science until bringing in McLuhan now in the fourth age of understanding. Mankind, who is basically second nature, achieves the identity of first nature during the 20th century sometime. So although we don't consciously understand first nature, we are first nature. There's no longer a separation between human nature and nature. And that
Does
and
that
that
does that
resulted.
resonate with you, Clinton?
I think if do you mean is this more like we've turned nature itself into an art form, or is this you will have the day for night, Finnegan's Wake,
Well, the proscenium arch. We created
proscenium
the
arch?
proscenium arch.
Yeah.
That
Oh, which sorry for so yeah the with the launch of Sputnik, McLuhan sort of saw that as a tangible physical manifestation of we've surrounded the entire world. We've taken control of the entire planet as the environment, which is under human control, because now from outside of the world we're beaming stuff into it. And so if the proscenium arch is a term from theater, that's the literally the frame of the stage from which the curtains come out. So if you're standing at the front of a stage performing, you're standing beneath the proscenium arch, the frame of the action. And so the satellite environment is the surface of the whole planet as the surface of a stage surrounded by the proscenium arch of the orbiting Sputnik satellite. This is how McLuhan was finding a metaphor, a poetic metaphor to explain the perception of having sort of captured the full world within our technological artifice.
Okay.
Yeah, and percepts always trump concepts, which is really something um, for a Kantian. It's almost impossible for a Kantian to grasp, because for a Kantian, everything is about concepts. And so one of the things they did was they completely reversed the orientation between an object and a subject, so that for a Kantian, an object is what happens, the thing in itself, what happens outside of human consciousness, unfucked with by human beings. And for Deely, an object is the thing as known. So inherent in the idea of an object is a knower. And that was also true of the medieval philosophers. So when you get into when you get into Descartes and ultimately Kant, they completely reverse this and say the senses are not to be trusted and stuff like that, and they reorder the senses so that the interior senses basically disappear, and all you have are the exterior senses. And they they claim that the object, and they lose the concept of a knower. So ultimately, if you're a Kantian, you don't believe that you can know anything. Really. All you can know is like the fact that you don't know anything and can't learn anything.
This perception that you're talking about that comes back in the 20th century, as opposed to the concepts you just described, what you're calling Kantian and Cartesian perception, is to walk out and look around and be like, my goodness, the world is, I perceive directly, the world is like a giant theater. It's like a stage. So the satellites overhead are like the proscenium arch, and to see the world that way directly, but through analogy, through the power of an analogy.
Analogic is the key. And it's also...
Is this Deely or is this McLuhan? It sounds like both, right?
It's a little both.
Yeah.
I merged
synthesis here,
That's what I'm trying to unpack what we're going through, but continue, please.
Yeah, so one of the things about the electric universe, this notion that of non-uniformitarianism, and the fact that the universe is not governed by gravity but by electromagnetism, which is 10 to the 39th power more powerful than gravity. It's a switch, so that it tells us that what we have been perceiving through the lens of our concepts is wrong. We've had a totally misleading concept which has been informing our perception, similar to the way that people looking up at the sky and watching the sun move across the sky in the ancient sky and stuff like that would have assumed that the sun was revolving around the earth rather than the other way around. So this notion that the universe is governed by electromagnetism is a similar kind of switch that sets our perception off in a different direction.
All right. So up until Einstein, let's say, we lived in the world of Newtonian physics, classical Newtonian physics. This guy, Sir Isaac Newton, says, "Oh, look, here's the simple laws of how physical reality works." Right?
Based on what? Based on gravity, right?
Based on gravity. Based on gravity. Yes. Based on inertia. Based on objects in motion staying in motion, and then they bang into how much they weigh is how much power how much energy it's gonna take to move them or to stop them. Right. It's the math of the outside world.
MASS, mass.
Excuse me. Yes, the mass. Yes, because weight depends on what planet you're standing on, or what the gravity, right? The relative mass of the planet you're on versus the object you're dropping. Is how much it's going to weigh, right? So.
But into the Einsteinian period, they continued with the notion of a universal gravity. It's called big G. So there is a big G constant in the Einsteinian universe.
Well, I don't need to get to that level to make my point, though. My point is that for a couple hundred years, everyone knew, finally, thanks to this wonderful new science called physics, that here's how the universe worked. And this physics is a conceptual model that we then, it's like the tint of the glasses that we put on to see the world in. So there's this concept through which we see the world. You learn these concepts, and now you can walk outside your house and see what's really going on, why the apple fell from the tree, how it is the moon stays in the sky and it doesn't come crashing down, right? Physics explains the movement of the planets up above us. It explains how to build a clock, how much force is in this spring to make this mechanism work. It explains how much to weight this pulley, how to create factories, how to create machines, how to divine, right? All of our industrial age and our mechanisms and our civilization is built up on this math thing. that
Well,
Einstein
that,
got this physics thing.
that's the foundation. It gives us a foundation of uniformitarianism. So it basically says that the universe operates like a clockwork, and we don't have to worry about sudden changes. We don't have to worry about these laws of the universe suddenly switching on us and changing on us and stuff like that.
Yeah, we finally
We can
found the laws of the
from
universe. These laws aren't going anywhere. This is the foundation upon which we humans can build our psychic conception of the world. Right? You learn these rules because the world is made of this math.
So the Earth has been cycling around the sun for billions of years, and with no change other than a local evolution on the planet and stuff like that. That's uniformitarianism. And along comes electric universe theory and says, no, within human memory, we were actually cycling around a different sun. That sun became a planet about 12,000 years ago. It transformed into a planet within the conception of the electric universe. Stars are anodes, planets are cathodes. So the star, which is a brown dwarf star of Saturn, under the influence of the new sun, which was a yellow dwarf star or a white dwarf star, which has an additional mechanism, which is like a transistor that allows it to self-modulate. Brown dwarfs don't have that transistorized layer. So the only thing that they can do when they're confronted with a greater force, a greater electromagnetic force, is to eject something. And they eject matter. And that's when things began to fall apart, again, about 12,000 years ago. And the transformation of the solar system took place over about the next 7 to 10,000 years, up until, well, the big change occurred about 3700 BC, which was when the polar configuration, which had become the orientation after after Saturn had become a proto-planet and lost its status as a star, and it was rotating around the new sun with a lineup of stars or a lineup of planets behind it, so that when we looked at Saturn, which was enormous in the sky and at the North Pole, basically, of the Earth, so that when everyone looked up from the equator on up, they could see Saturn as this huge globe in the sky, and in the center of Saturn was Venus, which was a smaller planet, which at that time was streaming plasma behind it, exchanging plasma with the former sun, Saturn, in such a way that there are spokes coming out from it, so that it defines a star-like entity. It was actually a comet at that point. It hadn't fully become a planet. And then closer to us, within the outline of Venus, was Mars. So Mars is the child of Venus and is identified as the pupil in her eye. So this is where the notion of the eye comes from, because looking up, all of this looks like a huge godlike eye with a pupil in the center, and Venus, and then the Earth. This is called the polar configuration, and this went on for thousands of years, and basically defines all of the great mythologies and archetypes in all of the religions of the Earth. They all reference these same things.
This is not in McLuhan or Deely, folks.
No, this is Velikovsky. Velikovsky got a few things wrong, but he got the overarching truth right. And what it lacked was a full explication of the physics that would be involved in that. And that's when Wal Thornhill and his group got into it, David Talbot and people like that. And they filled things out in terms of the theory and defined the way that the electric universe works, and even redefined atoms, atomic physics, and all of that kind of stuff in such a way that the explanation for this alternative theory about human history within the last 12,000 years makes sense.
But doesn't that get us back into the world of concepts instead of percepts?
Well, you can't. The way I look at it is that concepts are like tools. And so the evolution of tools become more useful as we refine them. And the processes that we use tools for become more refined over time. And so the same thing happens with concepts. But when we become too enraptured with concepts, they tend to influence our perceptions. So what you want to do is you want to use the tool to its maximum utility without becoming captured by it.
All right. Yes. Okay. So this is the first time I've heard the electric universe theory laid out. So thank you for that, Scott. Predominantly in mainstream science, what preceded Newtonian physics is quantum physics.
You mean was it? It was subsequent to it.
Right. So there's Einsteinian relativity and whatnot, and then there's quantum physics, and then so physics is obviously a large field with lots of theories. Again, I've never heard this long cosmological explanation for examples of these things, like the interchange of energy between Venus and Jupiter as a star. That's right. So you told that story, Scott, in order to flesh out the ideas or to demonstrate, how it is that these thinkers you're citing are coming up with a model of physics based on electricity.
Well, yeah, and the thing to recognize about modern physics, which is basically quantum physics, is that it's an extension of Newtonian physics, because it still basically relies on the notion of gravity and mass. Mm-hmm. And one of the primary insights of electric universe theory is that gravity and mass are secondary products of electromagnetism. So they change with charge. And so does atomic decay. So we can't use any of these as benchmarks anymore because they're purely local. We have to start looking for a different benchmark because, well, one of the examples they give is that if you look at the dinosaurs, how could the dinosaurs be walking around with such huge mass? The ratio of mass to muscle function just doesn't work in the case of dinosaurs. So and some of these huge dinosaurs were actually flying. So you have to alter the conception of gravity in order to make the notion of the dinosaurs work. And gravity has to be variable. So what would have varied the force of gravity on the Earth back when the dinosaurs existed, whenever that was and stuff? And it has to be electromagnetism. The charge changed. So the charge associated, which would be basically the negative charge, because planets are cathodes and stars are anodes. And they're connected through what are called Birkeland currents, which are like universal DNA. They're twisted pairs and braids. of
Well,
energy.
let's just again, so listeners to this program would be familiar with vacuum tubes, such as in your guitar amp, you got to wait for the tubes to warm up. These are electrical components, also called triodes, and nowadays they are shrunk down and produced out of silicon semiconductors in as these components we call transistors. They're the basis of all of our microcircuitry, computer chips, integrated circuits. They use these they're an electronic component called a triode, which we first created as these light bulb looking things with three prongs coming out of the bottom. And the idea of how a vacuum tube works is you've got an anode, a cathode, and then the third prong is this little grid in between the anode and the cathode that sort of gets a little tiny charge to start the juices flowing across the bulb so that the electricity can flow between the anode and the cathode. And so by jiggling the voltage on this little tiny grid that gets fed a little bit of power, you feed a little bit of power to the grid between the anode and the cathode, that starts the juices flowing into the middle of the bulb, and then all the electricity flies to the other end of the bulb. And so by modulating
it creates a threshold. It creates a threshold.
A threshold,
and
yes.
You can influence the threshold by influencing, by raising or lowering the gate.
Right.
Basically.
So in a capacitor-based microphone, let's say, I'm sitting here, I'm talking into a microphone right now. Let's say that it's a capacitance mic. So my voice is generating a very tiny, weak electrical signal, and that signal is being fed into this grid between the anode and the cathode. And so the very weak signal of my voice, which again, it's only enough electricity which can be generated by the sound waves of my voice hitting the microphone and jiggling a little bit of of a magnet over a coil of copper, just enough to generate a very weak signal. And that very weak signal jiggles just a little bit the electric voltage in this grid that's in the middle of this vacuum tube. But there's a whole bunch of electricity flowing potentially between the anode and the cathode. And that little bit of power that's going to the grid is sort of lifting and lowering a gate on this massive amount of power going between the anode and the cathode. And so that big power takes on the same waveform as the tiny bit of electricity which represents my voice. So thus the sound waves are used first in a magnet to create a little bit of power, and then the job of the vacuum tube is to amplify that into a very large amount of electricity. Let's say a better example than now here would be an electric guitar amplifier. The little bit of electricity which is generated by strumming the steel strings on your electric guitar as they wiggle over top of the electrical components go into the guitar amp, and then the tons of power, the heavy wattage flowing between the anode and the cathode create that very loud sound coming out of the guitar amp, right? So that's what a triode does. Is it
modulated by the gate? It's modulated
yes, modulation.
By the gate,
yes,
so that not too much goes over and stuff.
Yes, so that's what a transistor does.
Don Scott's explanation of our sun, he explains how the sun is a transistorized anode, so that it self-modulates its what's called the solar wind. And so what happens is the dam that is, well, first of all, you have to understand that the inside of the sun is cool. It's not hot. It's not, there isn't much nuclear fission going on there that produces the sun. The sun is produced by a pinch effect on a Birkeland current.
Mm-hmm.
So the Birkeland current is like a cable that travels to the pole. So there's an input and an output at the poles of the sun, which we don't see because we don't observe the poles directly. And as a result of that higher energy, it sets up a transistorized layer. So the sun is in layers, much the way that a transistor is in layers. It creates a double layer close to the surface. And so the energy that is produced in the interior layer, which is analogous to your mesh, only it's global. I mean, it's spherical. It modulates how much energy is passed through the Birkeland current to the equatorial plane, which we are on, and that produces what's called the solar wind, which is not a wind at all. It's part of a plasma sheath that extends out along the equatorial plane of the solar system and feeds the planets through their poles. So the basic energy comes in the pole, and there is an exchange of energy. And sometimes, well, you have to look at Don Scott's explanation of this, but basically what happens is if there's a dam that's holding back water, then even if there is a small bit that flows over the top of the dam, there's a steep curve before it tops the dam, nothing is flowing. As it comes over the top of the dam, it begins to flow down a potentiality curve. And when it reaches the bottom of the curve, it's going at maximum speed. So this is what modulates the outer layer, or the energy layer, basically, of the sun. And that's where all the energy, the high energy, is produced that makes its way to us. The millions of degrees of temperature and stuff that we see. But when the dam is functioning and nothing is getting out, that's when we see sunspots. As the sunspots open up a window into the interior of the sun, which is much cooler than the exterior. and that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? I mean,
well, I can visualize what you're saying. I again, the first time I'm hearing about any of this, and it's extremely interesting. But again, you're telling me that's interesting. So I think as far as I can tell, the point that we're making is physics ain't what we thought it was 100 years ago.
Physics isn't what we thought was 5 years ago.
5 years ago. Well, yeah, all right. Fair.
Well, Scott, we're gonna have to postpone some of the further on the physics there, because we're gonna have to get you on with Dr. Yu and some of the other physics people to flesh out some of these ideas. Because I want to really kind of circle to the media studies part of it. That's what
Sure.
I mean, we can go with the electrical thing, but we don't have enough physics background ourselves to really flesh out some of the things you're proposing there. But we'll do it. We'll give it justice another time.
So I'll just point out that McLuhan's method relies on using metaphors to understand our world, and so Scott was speaking appropriately poetically in using a technological metaphor like transistor is the term he started, and then I brought it to vacuum tubes to give listeners an easier understanding of how they work, right? But this is a perceptual thing. We didn't lay out any concepts per se. We think of the sun like a vacuum tube. Think of the planet like a stage, and the satellite like a proscenium arch, right?
So is that why we should, like, for example, when I challenge statism in government, monopoly government, instead of making arguments, I should say things like the government is a bludgeon, right? Is that better than saying this is instead of getting into abstractions about liberty and stuff?
Well, better is a quality of how well the rhetoric that you're using works in the context you're using it, in the proportion and the strength, right? So the concept of metaphor is very important to the role of ancient rhetoric. And
Right.
so to speak well is to use metaphors well. But what's good is to be an eloquent and righteous orator. That's what's good. And to
Well,
use the faculties, the tools of speech, to the best of your ability for the common good, right?
Well, the orator is the right brain. So you have this discontinuity between the left brain, which is completely absorbed in concepts, and the right brain, which is much more oriented towards percepts and influencing percepts. But then you have the corpus callosum, which is the analog of grammar, and that mediates or should mediate between the two so that they remain in balance and fulfill their proper function and role in terms of whatever the human purpose is.
But in that case, then we've been socially lobotomized, right? Because
Yeah.
That's a good metaphor.
Yeah.
Right. That's sort of the point that you see being made more and more. That's Ian McGilchrist. As so far what I've read, he's saying let's make the right hemisphere important again, or move to the right hemisphere thinking away from this left hemisphere focus. Now, my way of phrasing this would be more how Scott put it. Let's focus on getting the two hemispheres properly working with each other. Again, these metaphors are these are very reductionist for the sake of communication. The brain's a lot more complex than we're giving it credit for in this discussion, but nevertheless,
under the electric universe theory, there is nothing inside the skull, right, Scott? It's just like the sun; it's empty, right? It's cold. Or no, I'm teasing. I'm sorry, I'm teasing.
It would be a receiver. It would be a transceiver, actually.
Right.
So
I do believe that the brain is an antenna picking up reception. I do believe that. Yes.
Yeah, well, it receives and it also transmits. So it's a transceiver.
Right,
which is what.
Do we need to posit anything beyond the senses as the receiving system? Do we have to insert a sixth sense on top of just what we get from the end of our nerve endings on our skin and our eyes and our eardrums?
What do you mean by sense? Are you including the four interior senses?
I mean, the brain is a receiver picking up signals. Those signals are the terminus of our flesh and our eyeballs and our ears and the receptors in our nostrils and the palate of our tongue and our proprioceptive mechanism.
If it's electrical,
right.
Then potentially that's not the end of it. That's not the limit.
Right, but I don't know if we've exhausted the explanations which can rely on the known senses alone. I've got this problem with people who are super eager to find out what the internet's doing to us, who don't know anything about computers and what computers are doing to us. When I say computer, I mean you don't have a modem. It's not plugged into a wall. It's not plugged in. You're not on the internet. What does just having a personal computer mean? Like it's 1984 and you're sitting there on your Commodore all alone in your room. Computer's not as a communications mechanism. Unless you're talking about printing off a flyer from your printer, desktop publishing, word processing. Computers are a communications medium because you can type a letter on them and print it out and stuff that letter in an envelope and send it to someone. But
as a medium, they're more like a telephone than like a television.
Not if they're not plugged into a wall. You got no one to call.
Well, they're not like either then in that case.
Right, I'm saying we don't understand what computers do to us. So all the people arguing about what the internet do to us have skipped a few steps in their analysis. You got to go back and make sure you've exhausted your understanding of what the computer does to you before you start worrying about what plugging that computer into your phone jack has done to you.
So what does the computer do to us? What's the computer do to us? It detaches us from community?
Well, it lies about what it is. because it's an artistic creation that makes you think that there's a little world of objects inside of this box, the world full of these things we call files, which are actually just discontinuous tracks on a magnetic disk, a world full of these things called individual programs that exist in these little windows that we move and drag around. It's a world full of objects coming from the object-oriented programming language paradigm. Back when we programmed computers the old way, which is procedurally, you were basically telling the CPU what to do step by step by step. Every line of code that you write is another step. Like,
Right.
do this, do this, do this. It's like a game of chutes and ladders. Sometimes if you roll the dice right, you go up the ladder and then you fall down the chute, and then you go up the ladder and you fall down the chute, and you can't get to the end of the board game, and your program's still running. But eventually you get to the end of the game and your program's done. That's just the regular computers, how they actually work in a simple form. But we created these new paradigms, these new interfaces of turning our computers into object-oriented fantasy dream spaces full of objects that exist in relation to other objects, and object-oriented computer languages are more like to create a new this thing, and it's sort of like the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Mickey Mouse comes along and he waves his wand and he starts making magic things happen in this computer world, which is completely divorced from how the hardware works. It's a high-level illusion afforded by good graphics, afforded by abstraction layers and layers of misdirection. So when you learn how to use Windows, let's say, or you learn how to use your Macintosh computer, you're learning how the artists at Apple created this fake non-existent world for you to use, works to use the made up stuff, and you're never actually learning how to program the computer. You're not learning the computer. You're out of touch with the computer completely. All right.
And what's wrong with that, though? I mean, does everybody have to be a computer programmer to use the computer?
What's it like to be using a device every single day that's completely opaque to you? That's a black box that you can't open up, you can't crack into. There's a mystery. You should imagine you weren't allowed to open the hood of your car. Imagine if you know, like, sure, lots of people drive cars, can't fix cars. That's fine. Lots of people can fix cars. They can pop the hood. They can get new parts. They bust out the wrench. You know, my father's a mechanic. You know, he can take his machine down to the bottom. But if you can't do that anymore, let's say you don't have the source code to the programs, right? You're not using free software, or you're not allowed to because it's illegal, right? There's all sorts of ways now that computers, we can't know what they are, but we're surrounded by them every day. What does that do to our psychology? To have these objects that we use every day while not ever knowing what we're looking at, not ever being related to in our pocket. You know?
That
I don't know what fax
raises,
machines are, but they're not bothering me. You know what I mean?
That raises an issue. That raises an issue about the distinction between nescience and ignorance.
Okay, what's that?
What's nescience?
Well, nescience means you don't know something because the information is not available to you for one reason or another. You couldn't find it. There's some kind of a wall that's set up so that you can't reach it or get to it. So that's nescience, and nescience doesn't carry any blame. Ignorance is when the information is available to you, but you choose not to access it.
Yeah, you ignore it. That's
and so yeah, ignoring, right? So that's ignorance, and there is blame attached to ignorance. So you have these two concepts which have been unfortunately conflated, and it's important to understand the difference between them. So when you talk about the fact that there are these people that don't avail themselves of the nitty-gritty aspects of computers, how the computer comes into being and stuff like that, which is based upon electronic principles and ultimately on the transistor.
Yeah.
You know, capacitors, induction, electronic induction.
Yeah.
You know, voltage, current, all that kind of stuff.
Sure. Yes.
then when that's not available to people, then they're victims of nescience. But when it is available to them and they could understand it, they would have time to understand it. In some cases, just you don't have time. So that's a nescience variable, perhaps. So
That's a great
you can
distinction,
tweak
Scott.
the two.
That's very useful because in a world where we're taught, I bought this thing, but I can't know it. Do I really own it? I paid money for it. It's mine. Here's this piece of hardware, and all it does is lie to me. It pretends that there's this world inside this box that I'm manipulating through.
But what if you own a
screen.
chameleon and you don't know how it changes its color, but you still enjoy its companionship? I mean, do you have to know everything that you have, or it will get you?
A chameleon, you're not wrong. Biology is an extremely complex science, and life is one of the most wonderful, miraculous things that we take for granted as mundane. And people, when they look at nature, they can be wrapped up in ecstasy contemplating the true depth and wonder of biology, of nature, of the ecosystem, of how the chameleon changes its colors, how the seasons change, how nature works. It's rapturous. Computers, you could understand how it worked. Some asshole's hiding it from you on purpose to control it underneath your hands, and you're not even controlling it. They're controlling it just because of legalistic and design plans that artificially prevent you from merely being ignorant, but actually force you into this nescience.
What about this idea
you just
that
take it? You just take it because, well, that's just what computers are. One day everything changed because some update came in, and I had no control over it whatsoever, and it's not my fault because I wouldn't want to be responsible for my own thing. I just let someone else take care of it for me and tell me what.
That's how everything is in the modern world. Refrigerators, everything.
I fix lots of stuff. What are you talking about?
But I'm just saying,
I can
most
sew
people
a patch
don't
on
know
my
how.
jacket. I can fix my own stuff, or I can pay someone else to fix it for me.
Yeah, I'm just saying, most people, the vast majority of people, don't know how. A lot of things in their house, the car, like you said, and
they
the
could.
computer. But what about the idea that we're doing that it's very McLuhanite to interact with the computer because those buttons and files are metaphors. So
yes.
Our perception of them are metaphors.
Yes, it
so
is.
What's wrong with that? That's the way we're supposed to be
Well,
doing
it's not
it.
what's wrong with that. It's, do we understand the effects of creating this cyberspace, this non-existent virtualized space, and plunging children into it, 2 years old, 3 years old, 5-year-olds, so that their whole idea of what objects are and how the physical world works is artificially conflated with a make-believe world of make-believe objects that don't really exist. And you could say the same thing for the people on the TV screen 50 years ago. You could say the same thing for the worlds inside of a book. Like if a kid reads,
you're saying we don't
Lord
know.
of the Rings, what does it mean for there to be this whole fantasy world that they can get lost in and become a fan of for several years?
So you're saying that
right?
we don't know the psychological effects of putting humans in front of these screens. They're just too new. They're too novel.
And there are.
I would say that we also don't experience our interior senses very much. So we don't have much experience with them. We don't know how they work.
What's our interior senses?
Consider that the interior senses are memory, imagination, cogitative reason, and sensus communis, according to the classical understanding. So we understand memory and imagination, but we don't understand how mass technologies primarily amplify imagination at the expense of memory. And that basically, that situation defines the last 500 years.
Clinton, can you unpack that a little more for us?
What Scott's looking at, the expansions of the applications of Thomas Aquinas in particular, because so much of medieval psychology is built up on we'll call it the psychology of St. Thomas Aquinas, who tried to reconcile Aristotle what was known in medieval times.
Well, I would say it's Saint Thomas Aquinas on one end, and John of Saint Thomas, or John Poinsett on the other end.
Okay.
And those bracket the medieval understanding, and Poinsett basically brings it to fruition. He wraps everything up within a decade of the Cartesian publication, Descartes publishing his Tractatus.
Okay, so and Poinsett is Deely's main favorite guy, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's fair. So Scott, from reading Deely and from reading McLuhan, is looking at Aquinas and John Poinsett as sort of the medieval way of thinking about the interior senses. So again, when you want to look at people and understand people, well, the human brain is the most complex known thing in the universe. And so when we're trying to find language to discuss human nature or human psychology, we're always drawing on metaphors. 150 years ago, we were drawing on steam engines to give us metaphors, right? Think about how Sigmund Freud talks about how people have drives, or this language where you need to blow off some steam, or it's all pent up, this idea of mechanical steam metaphors for the mind. Now we use computers for our metaphors for the mind. At common, we say, oh, I still haven't processed that trauma, or the sense information goes into the eyes, like computer input. Or right,
I need to download this information.
I didn't download this, right? I have a hard time multitasking. All right. We're always just reaching for language to describe what's going on. In this very show, we use the left brain or right brain dichotomy, which has got a million representations in religious systems. There's a million analogs to the basic distinction: parts versus wholes, figures versus grounds, masculine versus feminine, right?
Everything can't be a metaphor.
No, but all language is metaphors.
Well, yeah. And I would say the notion of a metaphor is something that carries something over. That's literally what the word means. It carries meaning between the thing in itself, which is the subject, and the knower, and that process of creating a thing as known is metaphorical.
Right.
Essentially metaphorical.
And that's another word for signs, right? In John Deely's work.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. Yeah, it's a triadic sign.
Right. McLuhan says that words are a way for which we can let go of our physical environment so as to grasp it again in a new way. So think of how a child has to differentiate itself from its mother's breast in classical psychoanalytic theory, right? Typically, psychologists think that the newborn infant feels to be one with the mother's breast, and has to learn to differentiate and learn that it's different from the mother, who seems to be acting in accordance with a child's wishes, as though the mother were an extension of the child itself, right? And then no, you got to differentiate yourself from your mother, right? Words are a way for which we can let go of the immediate world, but then grab onto them through these utterances, these signs. He says money is the same thing. If I walk into a store and I see something I want and I grab it and I walk out, I'm shoplifting. But instead, there's this sign system it's the little price tag that says $9.99 that's on the shelf that lets me reach and grab that item through these pieces of paper in my pocket, right? Money detaches us and Marxists are saying this all the time, for instance. And I mean, their problem is that they hyper focus on this one example, but they don't see how they don't see it. They're not criticizing words with the same way, right? All of these sign systems, semiotically speaking, are ways for us to detach from the world physically, our body and the things in it and these concepts, and then grab onto and use and manipulate these things indirectly through these abstractions. money lets us grab onto things through this thing called the market, and through capital and through price systems and value systems. It interjects math into our sense of the objects around us. Words and metaphors let us construe and talk about and discuss all these objects and paint stories in the mind using, the books of a page. Right, let us tell stories that recount our memories and transcode those memories, and writing lets us keep those memories and those stories alive across centuries of time. Right, so like these are the very low level abstract well, not abstract, they're actually very embodied and real and living. And McLuhan used to say that talking about this stuff is like trying to explain water to a fish. The fish is going like, what water?
Yeah.
Where? He's like swimming around. He's like, where? Is the water in the room with us right now? Like, what's the stuff you're talking about? I don't see any. Well, show me some, right?
Well, that would be a good explanation, or a good way to approach the notion of plasmoid reality and electromagnetic fields,
Interesting.
because we're not generally aware of them. And in fact, as far as astronomers are concerned, they didn't even see them or take account of them as few as 20 or 30 years ago. They only until they started using radio telescopes did they even notice that there were such things out there. And now that they've noticed them, they can't explain them because they don't fit with the gravitational and the quantum theories that they've come up with. So they keep inventing these fantasies like black holes and dark energy and stuff like that. These are basically just fantasy placeholders for what they can't explain.
I'm still I still want you to explain why the current situation has amplified imagination without memory. What do you mean by that?
Well, that's a function of mass communication, according to McLuhan. So this began with the first mass communication technology, which was print. There had been a history of it prior to that, beginning with the invention of the alphabet, but things were still primarily oral up until Gutenberg. So even if you went to read something in the library, because books were so rare and they had to be copied by hand in scriptoria, most people didn't have them. So rather than having or owning a Bible, they relied upon the priest who could have access to the Bible to read passages to them orally during a religious ceremony. And the idea behind Catholicism was that they would run through the passages of the Bible over a period of 365 days. So they would cover the entire Bible in a year. And so whatever the public understood about biblical things was filtered through the perception of the priests. And that gave kind of that gave a power to people like Thomas Aquinas to delve into things that weren't public knowledge, and ultimately attempted to express some of those things in his writing. But even with Aquinas, hardly anyone read Aquinas until 200 years after he'd written, because they had to find a copy of his books in a scriptorium. So it wasn't until after Gutenberg that even the writings of Aquinas became generally accessible. So that is a situation where the general public was in a nescient condition. The stuff that was there to be understood was not available to them. So most of them didn't live in ignorance, they lived in nescience. And that has to be taken into account. But there were people who were knowledgeable at the time and had worked out a lot of these basic problems having to do with perception, and understood them to a degree that was not understood by by the public, essentially. And then along came Gutenberg, and everything got dumped on the public.
Right.
All of these books, everyone could own a Bible and stuff like that. And so, along with this opportunity to learn, came a whole bunch of mistakes and misorientations along with it, and people had no choice but to buy into it because it was just a flood. So they were stuck with, because they couldn't establish, let's say, Eddington's experiment to test the theory of general relativity. That's something you can't set up yourself. So you have to rely on people like Eddington to be telling you the truth. And most people don't know that Eddington lied about that. That his experiment was basically didn't prove general relativity at all. It also didn't prove that the sun was a fission machine, a nuclear fission machine. But they accepted that explanation because it was given to them by their scientific priests.
Right. And that's what we have today. We have scientific priests. We also have the media. Media is a priest. That's the priest class that's always giving us the perception of what the gods would have us to believe, right? And that's why they're
because they can manipulate our imaginations, and that's the only power we have. Our imaginations have been extended, but not our memories.
It's true. It's true.
So we have amnesia. We learn something and then we almost immediately forget it.
That's what I did on the radio show where I was playing clips. I don't want to take it into the political, but just I was playing clips of what like Stephen Colbert used to say when he was interviewing Obama officials about 2014, what we were doing in Ukraine. And he was talking about, we're trying to woo, this is Ukraine has got a relationship with Russia and it's abusive, and we want to woo her over to be romanced by us. And so they were laying it all out. And when I played that clip from 2014, the Stephen Colbert character is a totally different human from the one that we know today, who would say, shut up, do everything they tell you, get your, 17th product, whatever. It's just a totally alien world. But when you play that clip, it does expose how much amnesia we have, right? Because we're just on to the next TV show, right?
We did have, but our memory is now being extended and enhanced by the digital reality that we're now enmeshed in. And as a result, the old control levers that allowed the elites to control us, to control what we think and believe and stuff like that, are getting away from them. And the vehicle is going to places that they can't control. They don't know where it's going. Ultimately, they're just going to have to sit back and let it go where it will.
All right, this is.
They're not going to like it. They're going to fight it, but they ultimately they really have no choice. My other theory about this is that in line with the notion of what's called the Saturn cult of death, that the underlying understanding of the elites is that they know something about this Saturn history that most of us don't know, and they want to return to it. See, it was when we were a planet revolving around Saturn, it was an idyllic situation because we were inside the photosphere. We couldn't see the rest of the universe, but the whole planet was lit all over. So it didn't have a shining sun at the time that this was happening. It just had an orb that you could vaguely see in the sky until the breakup of the Saturn orientation into the polar configuration. So it's a little bit complicated to bring it back into condition, but historically, we had a pretty easy life during the polar configuration. This is what they refer to as Eden. And so the idea behind the Saturn cult is to get back to that situation of Eden when Saturn ruled the skies.
This is Arthur C. Clarke's 2010. the sequel to 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Well, I don't know about that. I'm just talking about what's the a guy named McLuhan wrote that book. But there's a whole series of books of it, mainly coming from David Talbot.
It seems like a way to try and square the circle and explain everything through everything else. And here's how the ancient myths and the symbols line up with the most cutting edge of science. And so if we call this period Eden, and then now, right? I mean, this is someone's artistic masterpiece of unifying all the fragments of meaning scattered across culture. It's a very romantic notion. I still what was it, Albert North Whitehead? McLuhan quotes Whitehead all the time as saying that the most important invention of the 20th century was suspended judgment, or the ability to hear everything but not ever, or not leap to, not feel the urgent need to make up your mind on anything that you hear straight away. Heard it.
That was good advice. I mean, I'm
right?
not suggesting you should make up your mind. There's still variables, but there are some variables which have been nailed down, and for the most part, you're not aware of them. You're not aware that they've nailed them down. So now the task is to overcome your nescience and eschew ignorance.
True.
That's
and yet
the challenge.
Simultaneously to overcome what we were earlier discussing as scientific priesthoods. And I mean, as a funny, there's historical precedent for that in computers. Before microcomputers, before you could own your own personal computer, to use a computer was to show up at, the computer center at the university and hand your punch cards over to the priests of the machine, who would then run your program for you. And then you are, right? So you're at the mercy of the machine operators, right? So this notion of priests is a metaphor.
I programmed computers using holo cards initially. That's when I learned Fortran and BASIC and all of those computer languages.
Yeah.
You used cards, and you had to sit in front of a card punching machine, and you would fill up the cards, and then they'd like sidle off to the side, and you'd end up with this big deck, and then you had to carry the cards over to the feed point of the IBM 360 or 370, and you feed them into the hopper, and they so I've been there.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I guess what I was pointing to is this priest metaphor, which again is something goes back centuries, for as long as the church has ruled in Europe and what have you, right? So the fact that we use priests and their control over the scripture, the rare printing of a Bible before the Gutenberg press, as the metaphor to explain scientists who deign to explain science to us. And now you're citing a guy who's talking about this electric universe style of physics, explaining everything about ancient cosmologies and pagan religion symbolically as a physical phenomenon that's scientifically groundable. He's one more priest. I'm not qualified to learn any of this stuff. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I think you are. It's a relatively simple paradigm compared to.
It's a concept to me, though. It's a concept, and it's a tentative metaphor.
If you can build a circuit board, you can understand the electric universe. If you can breadboard, you can understand the electric universe. There are only a few components.
It seems that this is a Girardian crisis that's emerging, in which Clinton wants to orient the culture around the scapegoat of the personal computer, and Scott wants to orient the culture around the scapegoat of Saturn. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, no, I think that what I started to say is that the people that are promoting the Saturn cult had a method of controlling perceptions, which was a series of formula. It was formulaic and ritualistic. So they used these rituals, which had been passed down over generations, and mass communication and mass psychology really begins around 1450. So it began sometime in the 15th century. And it transitioned into an electrical mode around 1850. And they'd been using these formulas without actually understanding them. So they don't understand really the way any of this works. They're just doing what works for them. And now we're in a situation where their rituals and their formulas no longer work. Things are getting away from them. And that opens up an opportunity for a much larger group, maybe not everybody, but a much larger group, to begin to understand what the fuck is going on. And what
Does
the
that
fuck
mean
is
we have to
going
return
on?
to? Does that mean
Oh,
we have to
no.
return to the medieval semiotic
I
perspective?
was gonna say,
Well, no, that's part of it. That's part of it. We have to retrieve things that were true, that we understood in the past. That's McLuhan-esque. I mean, you know about the Tetrad, right? David?
You guys would need to expand that a little bit more, but I think we're not
Well,
going to have enough time.
explain the Tetrad to him, Clinton.
So the Tetrad is the culmination of ideas that McLuhan had been elaborating for his entire life, and ultimately he came up with this 4-part structure or set of tools for understanding any given man-made or human-made artifact.
Is that's not the 4 causes, right? That's different.
No, it's not. It's not Aristotle's 4 causes. It's rather.
It's related to it, though. It's related to it.
Yes, yes, it is related. Absolutely. And you can learn all about this in the book Laws of Media by Marshall McLuhan and his son Eric McLuhan. Came out in the 80s. But the Tetrad is like this distillation of these 4 main things that all media do. So you create something new, and it's a human creation. Well, that amplifies something in our world, some power of ours. It emphasizes something. It obsolesces something else. That thing now becomes old hat, slips into the background. We ignore it now. It's not important. It's been replaced by this new thing. The Tetrad retrieves something from the past in a new form, in a new way. Something that had been once obsolesced a long time ago has come back and reemerged in this thing. And this thing, when you push it too much and use it too much, or push it to its breaking point, will flip into something else. What will it flip into when we start using this thing too much? So
that last is a good example of that. Is the way that television pushed anti-racism, and when it pushed it too far, anti-racism was pushed into racism.
Okay, that's a concept. It's very abstract to apply Tetras to concepts, although it's a valid usage of it. If you push a car too far to the extreme.
Well, no, I'm not talking about a concept.
If you push
I'm talking about a perception. Right. I'm talking about a perception.
Right. Yes, you're talking about a particular ideological strategy, anti-racism. I think a better example of the flip would be to say you push the car to the extreme, you get the traffic jam, and no one can drive anywhere, right?
No, that's
all right. That's a more relatable, I think, idea of a Tetrad flipper, right? But yeah, these things when you push them too hard tend to flip into, if not necessarily their opposite, but something totally new. And I mean, these are sort of these are almost I want to say it's the that's it. That's all. So yeah, the Tetrad is important. I think that it's a little too. There's a Tetrad for computers that says in this book, The Laws of Media, which again was written in the 80s, that says that what computers retrieve, I believe, is memory perfect and exact. And on that grounding, Scott's supposition that memory is returning thanks to the digital environment, and that is the mechanism by which our power structures are being shaken because our ability to think clearly is returning. I mean, it's a nice, succinct, and neat way to posit a great deal of the current social unrest through which we're experiencing, but I don't think it's quite the ground of the situation.
What's the ground
I
of the
can't hear you.
situation, Clinton? I'm gonna
Something
go back to
happened.
Scott, but what's the ground for you?
The ground
I
for
still
me
can't hear you.
is the fact that we are physical.
What
We're
happened?
physical
you-
embodiments. The ground of is physical embodiments in our relation to the real physical world, and not the virtual world of the content on our screens, the content of our books, the content of everything.
So your position, Clinton, really is that if you don't know how to build a computer from the ground up and code it, don't use it.
That you could argue that prescription from the ground that I'm building. I'm not saying that, but I'm sort of laying the ground for some radical extremist to make that argument, and that radical extremist would be a very totalitarian figure. But nevertheless, no. So I'm not saying that. I'm saying the people who understand computers have a responsibility to make them well and good and accessible at every level to the rest of us who will always remain ignorant about computers. And that responsibility can't be monopolized by a few private industries who then use that as a control lever.
Huh. Very interesting. Can you hear me, Scott? We cannot hear you now. So this is part of what you were talking about with the Tetrad. You were thinking so strong that you blasted out your ability to hear us, and then when you fix that, we cannot hear you. So I think we understand how this works. Is that right, Clinton?
There you go. Yep. Scott's flipped the problem on its head here.
I think the cult of Saturn got Scott's tongue for some reason. Why that happened, I do not know. Can you hear me, Scott? Can you send a telegraph, or how do we communicate at this point? Because I can't hear you. I want to let you have a final word.
We got the little text chat thing.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Okay.
But,
now we're going. It's all back to print, Clinton. It all goes back to print.
All goes back to print. Hey, we'll always
Scott has been rendered muted, and he can hear us, but he has lost the ability to speak. It kind of. Scott, any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, we'll read them for you, Scott. Any final thoughts? Nope, still nothing. Maybe it's best then that I say.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there you are.
Well, that's a different microphone. So, but I have two, so it probably sounds a bit different, right?
It'll suffice.
Okay.
Scott, can you give us a poetic, metaphor-rich, conclusive thought today?
About what?
Everything that we've explored today. You know, the implications of what we're trying to think about.
Well, the world is a dream. It began as a dream, and it gradually became lucid.
Oh, sounds very Joycean.
And Scott, you sound like Kanye West, where he says this is a God's dream.
And you will have the night for morn, something like this, I believe.
Very good. Take care, guys.
All right.
You too.
Thank you.
Talk to you later. Bye.
Good talking, fellas.